What's going on, 3DMJers? Welcome back to another episode of the 3DMJ podcast. I am privileged, honored, and it is a pleasure to be joined by head coaches Alberto Nunez and the Godfather Jeff Alberts today. And we're going to tackle a concept that I think people really struggle with in our space and in the fitness industry in general, and that is progression. Importantly, progression is a slightly different concept than progressive overload. And I think progressive overload is probably where people get it twisted the most. So, what am I talking about? What are people getting confused? A lot of people contact us and they ask about how to progress. Like, okay, if I'm supposed to do 3 sets of 6 to 8 on this given movement, when can I go from 6 to 7 reps or from 7 to 8 reps? Am I allowed to increase load and go up reps? And is that sufficient? And I think there seems to be a misunderstanding of why we have some of these models to encourage progression. And I think that really stems from not understanding what progressive overload is. Like, Berto, you were sharing with me how sometimes people come to you and they're like, yeah, I'm doing the progressive overload as almost as if it's a program. So talk to me about that experience and how people like articulate it to you.
I think what they're trying to say, because it sounds pretty simple, even, right? But what they're trying to say is, I, for the first time ever, have urgency when it comes to my objective metrics. But where they get stuck is now they assume there's this very specific pattern they must follow. And if they don't follow that, they're doing it wrong. They're not getting the benefits of this progressive overload. When in reality, it's more you find a threshold, right? That you can train at, that you assume is a good place to start. And your body just kind of adapts, and then eventually it trickles down into objective progression. I guess the simplest way to put it is like if we just played tennis, like the three of us, we'd be so sore, like 30 minutes of tennis. And then we do it again 3 days later and not as much, and then not as much. And that's progression, right? So it's something that happens anyways. And I think the things we have to focus on, they're a lot simpler. That just kind of happens on their own. I mean, we've used systems in the past with our athletes where we had these like examples of how to progress, like what a double progression, which most everything kind of turns into. Um, and that's helpful. But sometimes I remember people feeling like I'm not keeping up with like that speed. I'm either going faster or slower. And it's like, no, like that's fine. That's just where you're at right now. It's totally appropriate for you. So I think today we're going to simplify a lot of things for people who have gotten to that point where they're like, oh yeah, like in hindsight, when I am making the most objective progress in my training, that is when I get these structural adaptations to follow. So hopefully we can connect those dots for them a little bit, because it's actually, it's quite simple, something that your body kind of just takes care of on its own, so long as you're doing your side of the work.
Perfectly well said. And Jeff, you actually talk about this a lot. You're like, hey, if the effort is there, if I'm pushing as hard as I can with the constraints of the number of sets I'm doing, the number of exercises I'm doing, the workout program I have, everything else kind of takes care of itself. And you always encourage people to kind of take a step back and have a broader perspective, which, to be fair, I think it is easier for us to have that longer term perspective because we've all been lifting for at least 20 years. And I understand, like when I was lifting for 2 years, I was like, what do you mean it'll take care of itself? Like, what am I doing next week, Jeff? So I think it is like Berto so well articulated. I think hopefully we can put some of these things into context, and even for those folks who are really new to the game and they're thinking about like numbers on a weekly basis.
I think the numbers are important because it steers people in the right direction. Because what we really are asking for is effort, because that's what's going to drive the stimulus. And basically what follows that is the adaptation. That's what it would mean. Like it's going to come to us if we're putting those blocks in place. Mm-hmm. And I think the big hang up with a lot of people is they get caught up in the numbers. Because if you hit, let's say 8 reps with 2 in the tank, and you hit, let's say next week, 7 reps with 1 in the tank. That 7 could be just as good as that 8, even though it's a lower rep number. And I'm
Yes.
sure those are some of the things that you can address, Eric, as far as like the overriding principles of all this.
Absolutely.
Because that's a big stress. That's a question I always get, is like, I got to keep getting more and more reps every week, because if I don't, then I'm not going to make progress, right? Like, that's the biggest question. Where more load or what have you, or even more sets. That's a form of
Yes.
progression too.
Yeah, man. No, that's perfect. And thank you for teeing me up there, because it is really about how does the lifter see the utility of the numbers? Is it something they need to manipulate to make progress? Or, and I'm going to channel Brian Miner here, is it something I view to see if progress has occurred? And then I can use it as a diagnostic to go, oh, wait, my numbers really haven't changed. So maybe I need to do something differently. And to your point, Jeff, like, the numbers don't always need to go up. Like, if you look at a video of yourself lifting this month compared to last month, and the numbers are exactly the same, but you're like, oh, I use less momentum, I use more range of motion, and that 10 RPU is a legit 10 RPE, not a 9.5. Okay, you did the same weight for the same load, but the stimulus was probably higher, as an example there. So what do I mean by that? What do I mean by diagnostic? And I think it really is a terminology issue. So progressive overload is a loaded term. I sometimes wish that we could just remove the term progressive entirely and just help people understand that as they adapt, they have to keep doing things that make them adapt. But that is the definition of overload. So overload could exist on its own if properly understood. But then people also get the load part twisted. Like, when they hear overload, they think like, okay, well, if it's 100 kilos or 225 pounds, and next week it needs to be 230 or it needs to be 102.5, right? So I'm going to try to help people understand this. Do you guys want to hear a story about Pat?
We don't have a choice, so yeah, just go for it.
No,
man.
you don't. Yeah, Pat. It's Pat, because we don't know who Pat is.
Pat, okay.
Pat.
I
yeah.
thought I'm
Pat.
like, is this like a twist of the
Sometimes
Milo story? But we'll do Pat, I guess.
It's Pat, because we don't like. We're trying to be inclusive here. We don't know if Pat's a they. We'll just stick with that, and you can assign whatever template best matches your situation to make this maximally applicable. So Pat is not trained. Okay, Pat, they have done their body weight for 2 reps on squats. That one time, they got up off the toilet, okay, and they dropped their keys, and they had to squat back down to get their keys again. So that is what they're currently adapted to: 2 reps at body weight squats to the height of a toilet. All right. Now let's imagine that they want to actually get stronger and make some hypertrophy gains in their glutes and quads. They could, if we actually brought them into the gym and put a barbell on their back, maybe squat 60 kilos for a couple reps. That's their body weight plus 60 kilos. That's in their capacity. But let's think about what they're adapted to. Again, heaviest squats ever done? Double at body weight. If we put just the bar on their back and had them do 5 reps once per week with body weight plus 20 kilos, they would start to get sore and they would start to get stronger. So that is overload. It's a sufficient stimulus to produce an adaptation, right? Now the question is how long would that be overload for? For a while. It wouldn't just be the first time they did it, but eventually 5 reps with the bar would become just a warm-up for Pat for the eventual working weight that actually never came, right? And it probably happened relatively quickly, with maybe a month. So does that mean the next time they train, they have to actually do their 5 rep max? And then each week they need to try to increase their 5 rep max? No. And I think that initial example of what Pat needed to progress exemplifies that. But we get into a certain point in our career, we think, I need to beat last week's or last workout's numbers now. And they might try to do that, and they're pushing to failure, and they can't do it. And they think, well, I haven't instituted an overload because I look at my logbook, it's not more than last time. So I'm not going to progress. And you'll even hear certain personalities say, this isn't complicated. You just have to do more than last time. It is more complicated than that. Like, as we saw, Pat, again, making great progress with just the bar for 5 reps once a week, 1 set, that's it, for a month. maybe a month, 2 months, maybe, who knows? And then Pat is going to have to start doing something different for that warm up to actually be a stimulus. And then unfortunately, there becomes a point where just the constraints of one set once per week on one exercise for all those muscle groups probably isn't enough. You can train to failure and you probably won't see progress. So there's actually a really cool study that was done by Steele, and they took kind of like a group of studios, and they had 7 years of data on average from 15,000 lifters, which is pretty sick. And they're doing like old school HIIT style training. So they had a trainer with them pushing them to momentary failure, but just one set on a circuit of 6 different exercises to failure with like a slow repetition tempo. So there's no momentum, control the eccentric, and they go until they can't move it anymore. Jeff knows what we're talking about, old school HIIT. So these folks, they made strength progress up to about a 50% increase from baseline on just one set to failure per week for 2 years, and then they started to plateau. So now here's the thing though, 50% increase in 1RM is like not that good. Like if we look at a lot of different studies and strength increases, that happens in 12 weeks with like a moderate or high volume protocol. And we've all trained people. Like if you take an untrained person and in the first year they haven't like doubled their strength, like 100% increase, then something is probably not a good setup. Some people aren't that well gifted, but that just means they're starting from a lower baseline. But most people can get a lot stronger than 50% in 2 years. So just constraining yourself to just a single set to failure once per week for 2 years, you might not even get to what we would consider the intermediate stage. So at some point, we see that even applying maximal effort within the confines of one set once per week may not be sufficient to keep overload going. So there is a point where you might need to operate outside of the constraints of your given set volume. But when does that happen? I think it happens when it happens. So I think the way we should view this is that overload, we don't need to worry about the load. It's more like overstimulus, right? Have we reached the threshold of adaptation that we need to make another adaptation so that we can lift more? And then we will see that in our ability to do it. And I think we can talk about like practical progression strategies that perhaps encapsulate that better.
So it's almost like people are trying to be too proactive versus being reactive.
I
with
100% agree
progression.
with that. Yes, 100%.
Because like dieting, like for prepping, right? Like Alberto says, hey, let's not make too many adjustments. Fewer adjustments, the better. So we got this protocol set up. Let it play. Let it play until it dies out. When it dies out, then okay, we're plateaued. Now we have to do something to generate more progress. It's almost same principles.
Yeah, and you just have to decide, like, at what point are you okay with defining it as quote unquote dies out? Like,
that's the big
let's
question.
say-
Though. It's like, how do I
Yes.
know when to add rep? How do I know when to add load? So
Mhm.
so here's a question for both of you guys. Where do you guys think this stems from? What's the history of this as far as the expectation that we always have to progress every single gym session? Like, where do you think this originated from?
I think because we're used to that at the start, right? We come in as ambitious lifters that, want to get stronger, want to get bigger. And that's just what you get. It's just something you expect. So once you get beyond that beginner phase, you start to question when those weeks start to pop up where you didn't add a whole lot, at least not load. Maybe it's just reps, like even that feels a little wrong. So I think that's the biggest thing is just folks don't realize that like our progressions as more advanced lifters here, as advanced lifters, very different. Like if we tried to do the things that we were expecting as intermediates, we could all be pretty broken like by the end of the month. So it's just that like people they go back to their own personal history and they remember when they were making the most progress. And that's when things were objectively trending in the right direction. So it's important to, clue into that because, I think sometimes people look at the wrong variables when the body part is stuck. And what I will do to bring them back to earth a little bit is like, okay, so when did your chest make the most progress, right? It's probably when you went from the 40-pound dumbbells to the 80. We have to do something similar. It's just that the sinkhole just keeps getting smaller and smaller, and we can't expect to double like 160-pound dumbbells. Like, who's doing that, right? But if I can get you, say, closer to 100 within 2 years, okay, like we're on to something. So yeah, the rate of adaptation just slows down. A lot of people don't want to come to grips with that, and if anything, they start doing things that amount to less stimulus. Uh, Something kind of what Eric just mentioned that reminded me of a personal situation. There was a young lady at a gym that I trained at a few years ago, and she was my friend. I never corrected her on this because then you turn into like everyone's little personal trainer there. But I remember she would squat a plate. She'd get to her set with one plate, and she was so much stronger than that. And she had gotten great results, like kind of getting to that plate. And it was crazy because like over the span of like the year and a half that I trained there, like that plate was just being ragdolled more and more. Like it was like so she was still making progress even though she was just kind of marinating in the same sauce longer than she needed to. So I think that's a lot of the people who are listening here. It's like, am I plateaued? Am I stuck? And it's like, no, sometimes like you just need to like this is a good amount of exposure. You're recovering so that you can get back to at least baseline or very close to it. Sometimes you surpass it a little bit. On most weeks, it seems like you're doing a good job. You just have to be a little bit more patient because we use John Madden scores here because they rate everything from like 1 to like 99. So if like this set on a hack squat or your 3 sets on a hack squat for your quads is a stimulus of 90, right? If you repeat that the same week, guess what? Like, it's probably still a 90. And maybe 4 weeks later, it might be at 86. That's still a lot. That's still a massive chunk. Um, I wish people would understand that more, that, I think it's more so about what you chronically do over training blocks as opposed to like just looking at the highlight reel. Like, did you win the actual game? And you can only see that like if you push back a little bit and aren't just like zoomed into this set this day but the entirety of the whole training block.
I agree. I think it comes down to people coping or trying to cope with the inevitable slowed rate of progress. Another kind of depressing but kind of cool study that demonstrates that. And again, it's really hard to have like long-term hypertrophy data because we don't run around and track people with ultrasounds for years. But we can look at their training data, or we can look at their open powerlifting database, which is what Latella did a couple of years ago. Looked at 9,000 powerlifters over like up to a 17-year span of their powerlifting career. Right. Now, importantly, on average, powerlifters have been lifting progressively and hard for 3 to 4 years before they even start powerlifting. So here's the encouraging part. Like in the first year, powerlifters on average, and huge, differences between individuals, but on average, they increased their total like 20% in the first year. So to put that in perspective, let's say after 3 years of training, I'm pretty strong. I'm one of the stronger people in my gym. Let me get on the platform. You total 500 kilos. Within a year, you might total 600, and you're like, oh shit, I am going to be a world champion. Next year, I'm going to total 700, the next year, 800, the next year, 900, the next year, I'm a Super Saiyan, and then I'm fighting, Batman off, even though he's got kryptonite, because I'm just invincible, right? Unfortunately, that's not what happens. To go another 20%, on average, takes another 9 years of training, right? So now we're at like the 12th, 13th year of someone who's been lifting, and they're seeing that diminished rate of progress is way slower. But lifters don't just kind of like take that sitting down. Like they are constantly trying to do new things. Some people might be kind of marinating in the sauce too long. I think that's more personality dependent, and whether they understand progressive overload or not, or they don't know whether they're focused on the number as a proactive thing they got to push or as a reactive thing they can use as a diagnostic. I think powerlifting encourages certain things because you have to use the numbers as both, right? Like if your total's not going up, that's your bottom line. It's very kind of cutthroat capitalist in that way.
Straightforward,
right?
yeah.
For us though, for pure bodybuilders, and our clients who are pure bodybuilders just interested in their physique, focusing on the numbers in the wrong way can make you do things that actually reduce the stimulus, like you were saying, Berto. Like if you're really, really thinking like, oh, progressive overload, I need to know that I'm progressing, you can start doing things like cutting range of motion, getting sloppy with your reps, using momentum, whatever I can do to show in my logbook when I look back that I did more reps. Okay, now I've soothed that fearful person inside me who's worried I'm not making progress. Which I think would you speak to really well a lot, Jeff.
The quality diminishes.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you're losing that connection, that mind muscle connection they always talk about. Like that does need to be present because I think of it as like more like a skill. You're moving things A to B super properly. But there's also the camp about the mind muscle connection where they don't put any emphasis into the numbers. It's almost like then they're going too slow with their rep cadences, or maybe cutting range of motion too short purposely, where maybe it's preventing them from making gains. So is there any studies on that type of stuff where it's like it's the big shifts that we see? Because I see that you see the camp with the progressive overload, they're like, that doesn't matter. It's more about the mind muscle connection.
There sort of are a tremendous number of studies on this, but they're all indirect. So the way this is often done in research is when we do training protocols that are actually not interested in like proximity to failure, and they're interested in comparing two other things. So what they do is they have these two groups and they go, right, you're going to train, let's say it's comparing rep ranges. You're going to train 3 sets of 8 to 12. You're going to train 3 sets of 3 to 5. Both groups, you need to hit failure on your last set, volitional, momentary, it doesn't matter. And you need to have this standard for how it's completed, period. And then we're going to test you at pre and post ultrasound 1RM. The study is actually about what's better, training in the 3 to 5 rep range or 8 to 12 for strength and hypertrophy. But what they do, to read the methods, they go, okay, anytime they are unable to complete at least 3 reps with a given load, we reduce it the next set by X amount or the next workout. Anytime they can get 6 reps to failure or 13 in the other group, we up the load next time. So it's very process oriented and reactive in these studies. It's like, okay, we need to make sure they're staying at the target level of effort and that the range of motion is adhered to. And then they progress as much as they progress. We don't care about the day-to-day progression, and then we test them at the end. And I think that's actually kind of a pretty good mindset. You just set that a little bit differently. Like, what is that dial focused on? Like, am I really trying to accelerate the movement as much as I can on the concentric without actually, for movements that don't have much inertial resistance at the start, like creating so much momentum that there's not really a lot of tension in the lengthened position? That's a nuanced point, but I couldn't help myself. Basically, am I putting forth maximal concentric effort? Am I potentially pausing a little bit in that stretch position? Do I have the same range of motion? And are my RIR ratings accurate? And am I keeping the joints in the position they're supposed to be? I'm not doing an incline curl that's also a bit of a front raise, for example, and comparing that to me doing an incline curl where I kept my elbow behind my torso consistently. Those are just examples, right? So if that's what I think we should kind of do as bodybuilders is we hold steady the effort and the technical demands and the range of motion, and then we just push as hard as we are supposed to within the confines of the program to the proximity to failure, within the rep range we're supposed to have. And when we exceed it or fall short of it, we just adjust the load. And then we look back on it diagnostically and we go, all right, are my numbers going up? Can I get more reps or can I do more load? Is my volume load in some way going up because of reps or load? And if the answer is no, then the question is, okay, over what time frame? And then you have to go, all right, what's a reasonable expectation? And I think that's what we're really getting at, that your original question was pointed at, Jeff. I think some people don't have realistic expectations. They're still looking back at their newbie phase and they're going, every time I repeat this exercise, I should be able to add 5 pounds or add a rep. And that runs out of steam pretty quick, unfortunately. And
But
you get to a point where
it doesn't mean you're shortchanging the gains though. Like the visual changes that could potentially occur. Because even if the reps are staying the same, if you're hitting the appropriate proximity to failure, it's not like your muscle saying, hey, this wasn't a stimulus because the numbers are saying it wasn't. It's more about the effort.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we just have to realize that being able to see numerical changes happens on a shorter time course than being able to see like the 10 grams of muscle we added over the last month, or right, or, you know, like it might be 100 grams a year, and that may be what a really advanced lifter gets, and that's really not bad, you know, if you actually think about it.
That's where the frustration sets in, is because you can't, like, you're not seeing numbers move, and it's like a slow process to put muscle on when you're more towards advanced, or even intermediate. Sometimes it's a little bit slower.
Yeah.
So it's like you can get frustrated because you're not seeing anything numerically, or you're not seeing anything visually. Then you get the people like me who say, well, just trust the process, bro. Just hang in there and trust the process. Well, it's mentally, that's very challenging for people.
Absolutely.
So that's where it's hard to, as a coach, to really get people to stay in that process and to look outside of numbers at times. Like, okay, we're trying to maybe hit these same numbers, but improve the degree of skill. Like maybe it's moving a little faster, or maybe you're 3 in the tank now instead of 1. And if that's the case, okay, now we know for sure you're doing that with ease. Now you could probably increase the load or increase the reps because it's appropriate to do so now, because you're going to maintain the same high degree of skill. So like, if we're talking about double progression, let's say you're in that 8 to 10 rep range. It's like, it's common. Okay, let's get all sets towards the 10 reps across the board, but let's not increase the load just yet when that happens. Like maybe rinse and repeat that 2, 3, maybe even 4 times. So you master that. And once you master it, then that confidence when you do increase load is there. So you can maintain that same degree of skill. So the way I coach progression, more so like you said, Eric, it's like creating a structure. Okay, this is the sets, this is the rep range, this is the reps in reserve range we want to be in. But how we move from A to B while doing it, this is the standard. And anytime that standard deviates, then we got to pull back. We got to bring things back in, reset, and then go again until you get that competency at the end. That's kind of how I teach it.
I think that's perfect on like, what do you actually do when you step in the gym? We've set up a program. We've decided this given dose of training is appropriate. And then we have, what, like, to give people specific numbers to how I do it, which is exactly in line with the philosophy of how you roll. I use an auto-regulated double progression. So I'll give someone a RIR range and a rep range. And then, so let's say it's 8 to 12 at a 0 to 2 RIR, right?
Why is it set at 0 to 2? Just in case someone's listening, like, why are you setting it at that?
Good question. So if we're anywhere from actually hitting the most amount of reps we think we can get, but not visibly failing a rep, or being within 2 reps of failure in kind of this moderate rep range, that's probably going to ensure that we're making any one of those sets as about as stimulative as they can be, if they have appropriate intent, good technique, all the stuff we just described earlier.
So should they be stressing on, hey, I'm hitting 0, or should I hit 1? Should I hit 2? Because that's questions I get a lot too. It's like, probably it's not going to matter too much.
Yeah, I think we just need to zoom out a little bit. Like, we only can know what we know. Like, this is really, like, there aren't specific answers to this stuff. We're basically farmers. We're bakers, right? We get the recipe as close to what we think will work, and we put it in the oven, and we got to wait, right? You open that shit and you stick a fork in it every time, you end up just going to have this deflated cake with a bunch of holes in it, right? So I think that's really good context, Jeff. So that's why, right? And these things, we don't even get to know the impact of a 2 versus 0 RIR, because what if you got 6 hours of sleep? What if you got 8? You know, what if you were stressed? What if that banger song was on your playlist this time, but next time your internet's down? Like, all of these things are going to have an influence. So you have to zoom out enough so that the signal is stronger than the noise, right? So we got this 8 to 12. We got the 0 to 2 RIR. You're just going to use whatever load as you fall within those 2 ranges. And then when do you know you're ready to progress? Well, like you said, Jeff, once you can do, in my opinion, your first set for 12 reps at a 2 RIR, you've kind of tapped out that load for that session. You can come in again and try that same load next time. But if you end your first set at a 2 to 3 RIR, you're like, I might have been able to get 3. All right, well, now you know next time you can up the load, especially if you look at the video and you're like, yeah, that was clean. The velocity looks a little bit faster than the last time. So there's no longer a specified rate. Like, all right, this week is 8 reps at 100 kilos. Next week, it's 7 reps at 102 kilos. It is choose a load, and you can try to get somewhere between the 8 to 12 rep range and make sure that you hit a 0 to 2 RIR, and then you just repeat that for your next 2 sets. And if you fatigue and you fail and you're at less than 8 reps, then you probably need to rest a little longer, or you need to be a little more conservative because people fatigue at different rates. But ultimately, you create some type of construct, and then you look back on it. Here's the diagnostic part, because while that's what you do on the week-to-week basis, what I'm doing as a coach to help the self-coached people get an idea of how they would do this on their own outside of just within a given week is if the reps and the load are like never going up over a given time period that is attached to realistic expectations for your training age, now we need to assess one of two things. Is this program easy? You're recovered from it. There's no joint pain. Your sleep's fine. Everything's all good. And you're just doing this. Maybe this is a time to consider maybe trying to make your exercises harder, training closer to failure, or potentially doing more volume. If you're crushing yourself,
or changing rep ranges too, that can.
Yeah, I mean, potentially. Yeah. I think that's probably actually. Here is a really good point. It's much easier to go from your 15th rep to your 16th rep than it is to go from your 5th rep to your 6th rep. You know, in the first case, that requires a 20% increase in force production. In the other case, it's, I can't do math, but, 1/15 converted to a percentage, right, of an increase. So it is like sometimes what I'll describe as the difference between what we might call a novice or an intermediate or an advanced lifter is I give like real rough guidelines to kind of help people filter into, but they are, of course, like rough. Like for a novice, I think, okay, you can either add load or reps each time you repeat a lift in the same week or even week to week, right? If you're an intermediate though, you can probably add reps in the 10 to 20 rep range, like week to week. But if we're talking about adding load, like at least 5 pounds or at least 2.5 kilos, that's probably not going to happen on a weekly basis. And you probably won't be able to go from 4 to 5 or 6 or 7 to 8 reps on a weekly basis either. Those things might happen on like a month to month or block to block basis. And then essentially anything slower than that, you're some degree of advanced. And that's assuming everything else is going well. Like that's kind of like your best case scenario in my mind. So those are super rough, and your mileage may vary. Everything's different. And it's really difficult to even, so here's a tough one. Like people aren't even looking at their own progress. This is another thing that drives, you're asking Jeff, why people struggle with this so much is because they're not just looking at themselves from last month. They're looking on Instagram.
Good point. Yeah. Looking at other people.
Yeah, the grass is greener on the other side of the fence, and your phone is just a whole bunch of amazing lawns and tons of fences these days. So, like, and then if they're actually competing, then they're literally thinking about it's not just the best progress I make. Like, I need to beat these people. Like, in the urgency that modern powerlifting coaches deal with is pretty wild these days. Like, all right, so I was a silver medalist at Worlds this year. Next year, I need to improve my total and stay a silver medalist, or I need to be a gold medalist, or it's time to find a new coach, And that can be the case, even if they're actually progressing at somewhere close to the maximum rate they can be. That might be their mentality because they should, but they don't care about their own potential rate of progress. They care about how they are relative to the field. And I think it takes a mature athlete and it takes a good communicating coach to understand that there really is no offense in weightlifting. Like if the competitive environment gets you to progress at your fastest rate, if that's a helpful motivating factor, awesome. But you don't get to choose. Like you don't get to go like, you know what, this year I'm gonna make 50 kilos of progress on my lifts instead of 30 like last year. Because 30 wasn't good enough. I dropped to bronze. I'll just get another 20 kilos. Magic wands. Like it doesn't work like that. So that self-awareness, I think, is missing in a lot of people. So you'll see them, for the non-competitors, what you see is program hopping. And I think in the competitors, what you see is like coach hopping, So, yeah.
I even catch myself doing that even at this stage. It's easy to do. You see someone like, oh shit, they're doing this. I wonder if that would work for me.
Even at the world-class level, like with what I thought of when you were saying this, Eric, was in sprinting, again, like 100 meters, you got 10, 9 seconds, right? It's done. Like world-class sprinters will change something in their technique and go to old habits or something because of like what's taking place blink of an eye around them. And quite often that is what dictates who does really well, is like who can be disciplined, trust their own stuff as they're marching down the track, and not be impacted by, have their gait be impacted by what someone lane 8 over here is doing. So it's so wild how we let other people let us get in our own way. And I'll be completely honest. This is something that to this day I have to be conscious of. It was much easier, and Jeff, you worked out alone for a minute. Like when I was just training alone, like in my house, I had this shoulder and arm day that I would do outside of the gym. Nobody there, no social media. I'm the only one who lifted. You did some of your best work when you were just like in there, like baking and figuring things out on your own.
When you work in the dark. Like back in my early days, I worked in the dark a lot. All my preps were solo. There was no internet. I didn't have like go on the internet, see who my competitors were. Like I found out the day of the show. Yeah. There's pros and cons to that. The pros is I got to work in the dark. As far from an emotional standpoint, it worked really well. But from a physical standpoint, from a knowledge standpoint, it didn't, because I was limited as far as the knowledge. That's the beauty about the internet, is we got all this access to all this information. It's making the sport evolve. But that was kind of like the downside back then. But now I'm mature enough to see like the Sam Okonoas of the world. Like I may never beat him on stage at all, but just knowing I got to go against him, this was 2019. He improved me because I tried to keep up with him, but I wasn't trying to mimic him. I just found him inspiring. His work ethic, his commitment, his drive to get better. It's like, okay, if I want to, be close to him, I need to elevate myself and to put the same type of effort forth. So that's how I kind of use the internet nowadays as far as my main competitors.
What's going on, everybody? Eric Helms here, Chief Science Officer at 3DMJ. Thank you for listening to the podcast, and let me just take 1 second to tell you about MASS, Monthly Applications in Strength Sport. This is a monthly research review that I do with Lauren Colenso-Semple, Eric Trexler, as well as Mike Zerdos. These are experts in their field, and we cover all the information relevant to you as an athlete or coach if you're working with strength or physique athletes, or if you're a recreational or competitive athlete yourself. We cover nutrition, training, sports psychology, and health. And we do this in written format, as well as, since you like the podcast, audio summaries, as well as video concept reviews. If you're a trainer, we also have continuing education credits for ACSM, NSCA, NASM, and ACE. So head over to 3dmusclejourney.com, click on the products tab, and you can find us there. I look forward to seeing you, and enjoy the podcast. I think that's a really good example of what do you do with the information that drives your emotion? Because we can counsel people to be unemotional and to focus on themselves, but the reality is motivation. The key part of that is motive. Without a reason to do things, without a motive to do things, nothing gets done. You try to be completely unemotional about your training, why train, right? So you have to acknowledge, like I'll use myself as an example. I want to place higher at Worlds than 7th place. And I know that the only way that I can do that is by improving myself. And my rate of progress has literally nothing to do with the rates of the progress of the people who place higher than me. So that is my motive. It drives me forward. But then what do I do with that information? If I use it out of a sense of insecurity, fear, or I'm not doing enough, or I should be making better, or if I have unrealistic expectations of my own potential, then I can make poor decisions. But if I do what Jeff was saying of like, oh, this should be a motivating factor for me to push forward, and then I look inward, then I think critically, and then I have some space between my emotional reaction and my decision, I go, okay, what do I need to analyze and assess? Because going all the way back to the analogy we made of this is like a diet, I got 20 weeks, I make my first adjustment, I'm losing a pound a week, awesome. I don't need to change anything. Things are going well. Oh, it's starting to slow down a little bit. That's fine. Stay in the pocket. Well, there is a point where it can be too slow. Like if we actually go the entire 20 weeks with no adjustment and you're losing only a quarter of a pound, only halfway into the diet, guess what? You never get in shape. And just like the example of those, 15,000 lifters just doing one single set, you don't want to look up in 2 years and go, okay, now I'm plateaued and I only made, a 50% increase in strength. Like, you should have looked back at month 3 and been like, this program is really, really, really slow. Like everyone around me who has decided to get off the dogma train is making way better gains. Maybe I should do, I don't know, 2 sets, like some kind of like a reasonable adjustment. So there is a point where I think if you work in the dark and you're too conservative, and if there's nothing to drive you, you can be progressing too slow. But I put forth that that's a rare number of people, because most bodybuilders are like, I need to be doing more. Can I be doing more? And even Jeff, who I think is viewed as conservative, is viewed as doing low volume. The man right now is going, oh, could I be doing more? Can I be doing more? So I think you need that. Like if someone is completely uninterested in the rates of progress that are possible, the people around them who are making it, and they're competing in bodybuilding, I don't know them. I've never met that person. There's people who are better at managing it, who are better about internalizing their journey, and they like to compete, but they're still competing for a reason. I think they still focus on it. So it is just, can you use that information to facilitate better choices rather than to push you into fear-based or insecurity-based poor choices or inconsistency where you never even get to know whether your recipe is effectively baking that cake because it was a pie 5 minutes ago and now it's a cake. And no, take it out. Let's put some whipped cream on it. No, actually, you know what? I want a broccoli parmesan. Like, okay, what are you doing? This thing is just a burnt hunk of cheese and chocolate. It actually kind of sounds good, but the point is, you have to make decisions that are based upon not only your motive, but also objective information that you can assess. So I think that is a really, really helpful understanding, Jeff.
Okay, so we get someone new, and so the rate of gains is like it's quicker. So that's the expectations. Maybe it's that week to week, it's the month to month thing. So how long are we talking here? A year, maybe 2 years tops, where you kind of expect like this fast rate of progress, and we're talking just like numbers, not the physique. We're talking numbers. So we get into the intermediate stage. Like, what's that expectation at that point? So it's every month, maybe you see some numbers move every other month. Then it goes maybe every 6 months. Then you get advanced. You're like, okay, I'm hoping to get maybe 1% on my lifts this year.
Yeah. It is challenging. And I think
but this is a good podcast because I think what I'm trying to say is like tempering people's expectations.
Yes.
Like getting realistic with it, not putting a heavy emphasis into numbers, also skill, setting up a system for this and the expectations that goes with it. I think it's an important podcast. But we're all considered advanced at this point. So like what's your guys' mindset now with progression? Like both with your training, but also like in the physique. Like you said, Eric, you're trying to move up at Worlds and placing. That means your expectation is getting bigger and getting leaner. So obviously you're doing some things to make that happen.
Yeah.
And you're going in there also not knowing like who the next wave of bodybuilders you're going to be up against, because it's not going to be the same crew that in your mind you're kind of basing the last outing at. Like, okay, these guys were ahead of me. It could be like 10 new bodybuilders that come in and they might even be better than those guys. So how do you so again, it's like tempering these expectations and the progressions with all this. And the same thing with you, Berto. You're going into Worlds again next year. It's like a whole different, I mean, even from the time you competed last time to now, it's like you can see it's advanced even more so. Because now we're talking over 60 countries at Worlds instead of 50. So it just keeps a bigger pool, more talent. So how do you guys temper all that from a mindset perspective?
Again, the sprinter analogy is like I trust what I'm doing, that I put enough thought into what I'm doing, that I have no control over that. I have no control over that. And anytime I've been more influenced than inspired, it's led me in the wrong direction. So I think this is where having a realistic mindset of like what you are, what your max capacity is actually freeing. It's not limiting. Like I'll get a lot of guys that they're like, I think I'm an intermediate. And I'm like, bro, you're an advanced bodybuilder because you've been lifting for 15 years. Hasn't all been right. But you are at that point now where that's why you're here. Because it's hard to get things right for more than a month, it seems, right? Um, and it's a hard message to deliver. It can be because just like these like different milestones in the end of the um, beginner, end of the intermediate, and advanced just goes on forever till the wheels freaking fall off. Basically, um, there is literally beginners that finish their beginner phase, and they look better than advanced guys. Like that. That's just what it is, right? Um, so, like, for me, it's like I know what's good for me. What's a good rate of progress at this point? What my stock engine that I'm working with is. And this makes it so that, okay, like I know what to expect from that thing. And like, what is a good job, especially at this point in my career? Like, I'm not going to be, doubling in strength, like in the next decade. That's just not a possibility. But, if I can rack up little nibbles over time. And I think especially once you get to the advanced stage, a lot of it is just like how can you stay healthy? Like how can you prevent injury? Like there's just so many metrics for PRs outside of the logbook. The logbook I think at the end rules, but there's technical aha moments. Maybe you took someone on a lat pull down and you got them to I don't know, like not extend their lower back as much. And okay, now it's a whole different exercise, but it's the same exercise. Um, or more control, even though you've been doing the same weight with the across the body, like lateral raise that everyone seems to be doing these days. It's the same weight as you started this year with, but here we are in November and like, boy, do you got command of like the whole damn thing. So there's so many nooks and crannies when it comes to places and ways that you can progress. Shoot, is bodybuilding being less invasive to your personal life? There's just so many places we can go to. Like that's literally what we do. Just like we look at the spreadsheet for a little bit. We look at the videos that they send in, but there's all these wonderful places and areas that we all have a lot of room to improve on that it's not as clear, it's not as flamboyant as like when you are an intermediate. But But usually at this point, like when you are making progress, it's because you got a few things right. Whereas, beginner for sure, intermediate, it's just that you just waited, you just never stopped, which, there's something to be said about that. But but yeah, it's hard to navigate, Jeff. And at some point, like you and I, yeah, we gonna be riding that bench at WNBF Worlds,
Mm.
uh, but I mean, that's just part of it, man. Like we've had our peak, I guess.
I think I resonate a lot with that. And yeah, I think just knowing that there was some dude you went to high school with who you peek in the locker room and you're like, they at 19, if they lift for a year, could probably win a pro card. And that is their novice phase, I think is a really important thing to recognize. And that if they take it all the way they possibly could, they might be a world champion by their intermediate, and then they'd be untouchable if they stuck with the sport and had the right mental grit for their entire career until they'd retired. And we can think of examples like that. We talked about them in the Greatest of All Time podcast. While for me, my advanced stage is I got to Worlds, like, and sweet, like, so I think if your self-worth is wrapped up in your objective placing, your subjective objective placing, or in your capability as a bodybuilder, rather than your self-worth being wrapped up into the richness of who you are, people don't want to look at that. They don't want to honestly assess what their potential is, and they need to keep that somewhere else because it's an existential threat to their self-worth, right? And those people, ironically, never get to their potential because of that. They try to either narcissistically overreach, push past it and be like, oh no, I'm going to get, and they do silly things, or they get discouraged and they never push themselves to where they actually could get to. Just depends upon how their personality copes, right? So I think you kind of have to hold those two things separate. Like, I am proud of myself for the gains I've made, but I'm aware that Eric Helm's gone from 95% to even 97% in a time period where no one thought he would get to 95.5%. May not make a goddamn bit of difference on the world's placing on stage, but he definitely improved. It just isn't enough, so I can be proud and disappointed of both at the same time. And I think you kind of have to get to that point of maturity. So that's the mindset part. I think the other part, Jeff, is you can focus on the numbers, but not in the way that you do as a novice, or not in the way that I presented how people do it when they ask us questions, or it's just going to frustrate you and confuse you and lead you to program hopping, or incorrectly assessing when things aren't going well. But it needs to be diagnostic. It needs to be more and more and more and more and more diagnostic than anything else. So for example, with me, how do I decide how many sets am I doing, the rep ranges, the loads, all that stuff on a regular basis? It's based upon what is happening and my understanding of principles. So right now, I am doing more than I need to make progress because I'm trying to be better as soon as possible. So I'm aware that I'm essentially speeding, and an injury, burnout, a niggle, or something that bothers me is basically getting pulled over by the cops, right? So if I get pulled over by the cops, I'm actually gonna get to my destination slower, right? That's not helpful, right? So I am thinking about, all right, well, I need to be behind someone else who's also speeding, and I need to, be checking my rearview mirrors, and I shouldn't go 150 in a 100. I should go 120. So what does that mean? So I need to constantly assess, what is my recovery like? How are things going? I need to be objective about that and not just get caught up in I could do more. Like, I can physically do more, but should I? Right? So I think about it kind of going back to very, very structured analytical numbers. I sat down and I set up an appropriate volume, and then I used that model of autoregulated double progression. And when I am unable to progress with the given dose over what I think is a reasonable time frame, and we're even talking like I went from 15 to 16 reps on lateral raises once, like that's good. Any progress for someone who's been lifting 20 years over a block-based time frame is fantastic. But you have to kind of have that initial prior. Like, I have that prior belief of what is an appropriate rate of progress, and I think that's where people get hung up. But if you are following sound principles with an appropriate dose of training that leaves you feeling beat up and barely recovered on time, but you're progressing, the answer is probably not doing more, right? And if you're making progress within those confines, and there's variability, because sometimes you're fatigued, sometimes you're not, sometimes your nutrition is in order, sometimes you didn't sleep well. Awesome. You kind of have to just accept that whatever rate of numerical progress you're getting is probably about as good as it can get. And then you focus in on the day-to-day. Could I have made that cross-body lateral raise a little better? Was I really at a 10, or was that a 9.5? Okay, when I hit that 10, did I then actually control the eccentric back, or did I just kind of let that weight stack fly away from me? And I think getting too caught up in the numbers, it takes away the focus on that. And I think getting too caught up in volume can take away from that. Like, when you're thinking, I have to make sure I don't do this because I'm doing a lot of volume. I've got 4 sets on this exercise and then 2 more exercises for the same muscle group with 4 sets. I can't be in the mindset of I need to get through 12 sets on this exercise. I have to be in the mindset of, let's make this set count and make it as best as I possibly can within the definitions of what I have. Reset, do it again. Reset,
that's how
do
you
it
know
again.
if you're doing too much volume. If you're
Yes,
you're basically candy ass in your sets.
100%.
Just like, okay, if you're holding back, it's like, well, okay, instead of 12, maybe you should be doing 6 or 8.
Yes. Yeah. Anytime your quantity starts to degrade from your quality, it's probably not worth it. I think that's the way I like to frame it. Because, like, if we look at the new meta regression on volume, and I'll be quick, I swear to God, I know I say meta regression and some people are like, I'm out. The good news is, in this research,
I'll just keep saying candy ass. We'll keep them engaged.
you keep throwing candy ass, and you're going to keep those grumpy old men in the party. So there is not an inverted U in the data. It must exist in the real world, okay? Because there is a point where volume starts to work against you. But over the 2 to 3 month long studies that we have where people are being trained the way we described before, there's just diminishing returns. There is certainly some point where it turns into so much muscle damage, it's like an injury effectively, or you break or the wheels fall off. But the good news is we don't have to worry about like this insidious slower rate of progress because you're not recovering from the volume. What we do have to worry about is if you try to do so much volume to replicate these studies that if you were a participant in those studies, all of a sudden you're no longer meeting the criteria of training to failure or training to the RIR target or changing the range of motion or being unable to come in and do your job on a day-to-day basis, that those research assistants basically make sure you do, unless you drop out of the study, which then you don't get counted, right? So anytime your attempt to do more volume takes away from something else, it's probably not worth it. Because that relationship in that meta-regression, the cool thing about a relationship between two variables is we can estimate how much of their relationship is explained by one another. So like volume is just the number of sets, but there's the exercise selection, there's your nutrition, there's your genetics, there's your rest periods, there's everything else that can influence hypertrophy. All of that is causing the actual hypertrophy you see in that study. We're just trying to figure out how much of it is related to volume. And it's about 20-25%. So if you are losing all these other really key important variables like your nutrition, your sleep quality, your proximity to failure, your technical execution of the exercises to try to get slightly more of what at most can be 1/5 or 1/4 of what explains your gains, it's not worth it. So that is what you need to assess. What's an appropriate training dose? Well, if I up the dose, then I better not degrade the quality. And if I do, that's the point when volume is working against me. And I think that's something that people miss. So like you set up a given dose, a given amount of training in those confines based upon your training status, how close are you to your potential? Are you progressing somewhere numerically, even if it's just a rep here or there or a qualitative performance of a rep here or there? Great. And if it's really, really slow, like if you're only been lifting a year and it takes you 6 months to even add a rep on like a 10 plus rep range of motion, yeah, something's off. Either you're not recovering or it's not enough. You just need to actually work harder. But that's the way you view it. It's not like I need to do something different if I'm not meeting this rate of progress that I think is appropriate. It's more like, all right, some progress should be occurring, but I've set up all the ingredients, the oven's at the right temperature, I've got it in the right spot, I sprayed the tin, whatever, let it bake for a bit, and then I use the numbers to assess, was it a good recipe? But I think people really struggle to do that. I struggled to do that for years.
That's where coaching comes in. Like if you're a beginner, even intermediate, like having someone with more experience who understands all these principles and how you basically experience these things. Like it's easy for me at that point to sit down with someone one-on-one and say, okay, what did you get from this? Like, what did you experience? Okay, you hit all these numbers, yes, but how did it feel hitting them? Was your form on point? Were you going A to B just precisely? Like all these things you can look at, and they may not know how to assess that. That's where the coaching would come in and help you with that. Because now at advanced level, it's like we all can like look within ourselves. Like Berto's looking at all these other things he looks at for forms of progress outside of numbers. Like he still has, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, some type of system that's in place, but the system's changed for where you're currently at in your process. And I kind of do the same thing, but I think it's always good to have someone in your corner to help you kind of get, that's what we do is we get people to become independent, self-mastery.
Let me ask you guys this. I noticed this in the fitness industry, like who sells programs or who sells whatever. They often sell you on you need to have different expectations. Like if you're not making great gains, then there's a problem. Or did you know that they create a problem and they give you a solution? And a lot of the times, if you're selling a program or a coach, it's, you thought those were good gains? Nah, those are terrible. Or you're not making gains. You need my thing. And I think if you're looking at social media, which automatically selects for the most impressive physiques, the most impressive numbers, the most impressive transformations, and you're getting those marketing messages, I think people's expectations get all messed up. And that's where I totally agree with Jeff. I think the value of a coach is that we've seen people sending us pictures of them in their Speedos on a regular basis, or in their, posing suits. We're seeing their spreadsheets. We're seeing them bust their butts. They're sending us training videos. You guys have seen each individually close to 1,000 people now, if I was to guess at this point. What across the range of natural potentials someone could have, even when doing everything right at various stages of their career. And I think that's actually really hard for someone to tell them themselves that they're just looking at social media.
100%. It's true. Here's the thing, like, you can have someone that's 20 years old, but yet they look like a 40-year-old, like their physique. They look advanced. But then if you look deeper, you see how they do things. You're like, whoa, they're like, it's very sporadic. And if you look even deeper, you can kind of see like maybe the maturity level of this person isn't really on an advanced level. And that, like, if you're someone who's seeing this person from the outside, like, man, this person's doing everything correct. And if this person's selling you a 12-week program, let's say, there's some issues there. Because the way I see advanced body is not just from your physique development, but it's also how you go about your day to day. How well can you adjust on the fly, make good decisions? It's kind of like a good, like Tom Brady, right? Like, he's not the most gifted athlete in the world, but he makes up for it with his experience and his knowledge. You can read the field before the play even happens. He knows exactly where to go with that ball. He knows how to do one little sidestep to avoid a blitzing linebacker. Like, those are the things that, to me, like, it defines like being advanced. And it's easier to, like, again, like, because you have that experience behind you, to assess the progressions, right? Like, okay, I hit 8 reps this week. Should I go to 9 or what have you? Like, you have to be in that state in order to make those good decisions like that. But as a beginner, intermediate, if you're just looking at social media and kind of just falling blindly, it's like, how do you reach self-mastery by that?
Yeah, and the value that self-mastery gives you is it gives you other opportunities to make decisions on a day-to-day basis to potentially keep advancement going that are maybe coloring a little outside the lines. I was just reflecting as you were talking, Jeff. I'll give you guys an example. So let's say, I stick with the auto-regulated double progression. We're doing X number of sets, 8 to 12 reps, 0 to 2 RIR. And you know that once I can get a load for 12 at a 2 RIR in my first set, I'm quote unquote allowed to go up and wait next time, right? I think, so I do something, I will make decisions even outside of that sometimes. So let's say, for example, I come in and I know today that I'm strong, but I'm not good at reps, or vice versa. This happens to me all the time. And
Yep. I know exactly what you're going to say, because you've trained long enough. You've done this. Yeah.
Yeah. So, like, all right, I know today I'm strong, but I don't have the gas. And I look through my training log and, all right, what's my best 6 rep max with this, on this movement? Do I think I can get that today? Let's do it. And that is a little more of an aggressive approach to auto-regulation. Because I think sometimes people think auto-regulation, like, it just holds you back, prevents you from overshooting. But no, I think it can allow you to move forward. So I'll even make a less coloring outside the lines example. Let's say you've got everything set up in your program as 6 to 15 or even 6 to 20 auto-regulated double progression. Sure, you might stick with the same load, look back each week, and you're trying to add reps. And eventually, once you can get 20 reps at a 2 RIR on your first set, you're allowed to go up and load. Okay, that's like the baseline assumption. But if you're advanced enough and if you have enough body awareness, jump it. Like, if you think you're just not strong today, but you can hit a new 15 RM, do it. Go for it. Yeah, you can hit a 0 RIR at a 15 on your first set. It's still in the program, even if last week you were doing a set of 8, right? And I think knowing to strike when the iron is hot, or to hold yourself back a little bit. I mean, you can do that as well, of course, if that's appropriate. But I will have weeks where, I've been doing, like, okay, I've gotten 3 sets of 7, then I got 1 set of 8, 1 set of 7, 1 set of 7, then I got 2 sets of 8, 1 set of 7, and the next week I'm like 15. It's like, what are you doing? And I didn't do 15 with the same load. I went down in load because I just didn't feel strong. My joints were feeling beat up, but I knew that I could push myself for a high rep set or the exact opposite. I can't predict when that's going to happen, but I want to be able to take advantage of my experience to do that when I can. So that's one of those things where if you'd given Eric Helms the autoregulated double progression from 4 or 5 years ago, I would have wanted more information. Well, how do I know when to do that? Not even 4 or 5 years ago, probably 4 to 5 years into my training. Because
That's
4 to
probably
5
what's so
years ago,
important. Like beginner, intermediate, it's good to have these very structured progression schemes in place because it's a system and it takes that thinking out of it. But as you go through that process with that, you start to learn what feels good, what doesn't feel good. Then from there, you master that and you get to where we're at now, where it's almost like I don't have a progression scheme in my programming. I got sets, I have a rep range, and I know the reps in reserve. And that can change session to session. Like certain movement might not feel too good this week. Okay, I'm going to do higher reps with it with a lower load, but I'm just going to make sure I'm closer to failure. Or vice versa. Like these high reps, man, I'm just winded. By the time I get to the third set, it feels like trash. So I might increase the load, go to the lower rep range, and just be maybe a little further from failure. And I'm still going to get probably the same stimulus regardless. And I'm comfortable with that because I've gone through being super rigid with all those progressions in the early days. Because back when we first met, I ran linear progression like there was no tomorrow. And I progressed super well on it, but that's how I learned like how it worked and I got good at it. And same thing with double progression and so on and so on. So I do think as you're newer, you should have a little more structure and be a little more rigid with things. So it gives you the opportunity to learn. It's easier to assess because everything's very static.
Berto, you're working with a lot of very high level athletes right now. Do you find that the personalities differ enough where, because what I've noticed, I'll carry what Jeff said and I'll pose it as a question to you. The advanced athletes do have that ability, but they're still human. And sometimes they can err on the side of convincing themselves, rationalizing that this is the right move intuitively, and they're pushing either too hard, too fast, too much, too soon, or they can be on the other side of it and they can be making these adjustments all the time when in reality they need to manage some other aspect of their stress or their emotional regulation, or they could actually give a little more. And yeah, they are making these adjustments, but they could be taking themselves a little further. Like, how often do you see the split between advanced athletes kind of falling on those two sides of it? And I mean, the same person can go both ways too. I do, but I'd love to hear your perspective on that.
I think at that point, they understand themselves and what they're prone to. It doesn't mean it goes away 100%. But I mean, that's why they come to me, because they want me to coach them in a way that they wouldn't coach themselves. Like that's why they're there. So they understand that, and we kind of both know what to look for. But of course, I'm going to be a little bit more objective when it comes to when I see, whatever this behavior is. It's like, okay, too much rocket ball. Okay, now you're getting, this person's getting too lackadaisical. But whoever you are when you enter the sport, like that's just who you're going to be until the end. You've just kind of learned to temper down that side of you, and if anything, leverage it so that it is an advantage. Like whether you're more chill or you're more of like this animal, you just kind of how to make that, in the case of the animal, because it's very obvious there, how to make this like animal work for you as opposed to eat its owner, right? But yeah, who you are is who you are. That never changes. That never changes. That's why you'll always hear, the older folks talking about, like, I swear I feel like I'm still 17. It's just I got so many more responsibilities thrown against me. It's because you're still the same person. You just know more, and you've seen yourself do commit more errors, but also create more success for you. So that's what they have to lean on. It's just like the receipts of good work, but also their mistakes. So a big part of this we talked about it, and I think the farmer analogy is brilliant. It's like, I don't know. I think I did that right. I followed all the instructions, and I think it's going to work. But all we can really do is like sit back, observe the plan, and in the meantime, while we're waiting for this to manifest into something, there's all these basic fundamental things that you can never be too good at. Like you can never be like too good at your sleep, your stress management, knowing when to eat more, eat less, um, all that stuff. So there's a lot to do, like in between these sessions, where hopefully you are progressing, and you'll never be too good at those. There's always that's the part that's, I guess, the process, right? Like that is where the part that people tend to overlook, when in reality it's again, like we discussed earlier, it's like something that your body kind of does on its own. Like if you were to see what goes into digesting an apple, it's quite crazy from a chemical standpoint, but your body just kind of does it. Same thing with training. Like what goes into like building 10 grams of biceps is pretty ridiculous. Your body just kind of does it, but you have to do all these other things, during a span of time. So yeah. Yeah. They're a little bit of both. You'll always be the same person. One thing I've actually encouraged a lot of my athletes to do is to find a training partner that is the exact opposite of them. Right. So if you're an animal, it's like you need kind of that nerd there, and vice versa. This is one of the reasons that I think uh as training partners, women and men do really well together, because like the men, like you lift with your boys. What are you going to do? It's like your boys are like, bro, you can add a 10 to that bench, and it's like, no, he can't. No, he can't. Don't make him. You lying to the man, right? And then quite often with women, it's like you got more in you. Let's do this. So they kind of balance each other out. But at the end, yeah, a training partner, a good one, that is a missing sauce for a lot of people when it comes to getting the most out of themselves. Like you did that a little bit when you were training here. It was crazy because we match up well in that, and I think in on that side of things, I think over the years you've grown a little bit more like me. And then as I see I'm like, bro, he gets after it. He is like a dog. He has like an engine that doesn't stop. Like it's insane. In the past, you were more like you let the nerd get away from you at times, right? So it's crazy. Yeah, when we trained, like those few sessions, I was like, oh shoot, like if I had Eric here, like dude, it'd be so much better.
Getting
So
those
I
extra
think,
reps. You hitting
yeah,
they're
it's
progressive overload, bro.
with the right training partner. You could also have a training partner that's, again, like we we tend to pick people that match us, and yeah, that's where things go wrong.
It's funny. I've gone through phases because when I first started lifting, it was like completely emotional. It was to deal with like trauma. And then I remember when I started lifting with Adam, we were like, if one of us was away, we're like, how do we train? I can't go past failure.
Yeah,
Like, and then
yeah,
and then I got all into the science stuff.
hmm
And I remember, because I remember early on, you were like, you could probably keep a couple reps in the tank. And I was like, that's a good point. And then
yeah.
I went down that rabbit hole. And then I think I've wavered on both sides of that. Um, I think it doesn't matter, but it's not about me. But I think, yeah, that's really important to know who you are and what your tendencies are. I think that's a really, really good point. And the difference between an advanced athlete, in my opinion, and someone who's a little more intermediate is the lack of that awareness. Yeah. Or the lack of acceptance. Like if some people are just like at work, and like, and they're like, there are people who that is central to who they are. But I think for most people, it is, I'll say it, it's virtue signaling in the bodybuilding community, right?
It is
Yeah.
100%. The dogs aren't the real dogs. It's crazy. The dogs are the people who understand their limit, because they're loading that thing right and having it progress over time. Whereas like these other people just hiding it. Very very few dogs out there, bro. Very few dogs. A dog understands the limit, like a human dog, because at the end, that's their most powerful weapon.
Yeah. And I will say just to be someone who has gotten on stage and be in decent condition, like, yes, you've got this stamp of
Yep.
approval. You work very hard.
Absolutely.
You do something that only 1% of people who lift weights even do. You're
Yep.
good, but there are levels to this, and there is relative
Everything, yeah.
comparisons. Yeah, 100%. Yeah. I like where this went, guys. Is there any other closing thoughts on progress. I think we managed to cover, like, hopefully the auto-regulated double progression helps people understand how overload actually plays out and how you're reacting to and adjusting based upon what's happening, not trying to actively drive progress. And then I think we talked about the mindset like really well. I'm really glad.
That's I had to get those questions in there. Make you guys get a little deep, a little emotional. You know,
Bring out the best in people, Jeff. That's why you're a good coach.
I do all right.
Stop it. You do great. Berto, anything else you want to add on this sucker?
No, I think we did good. We went through how it's stage dependent. Everything's kind of an estimate. Like, we don't really know. Like, athletes on there, and they swear it's like, oh, he's nailing it this first time. He's like, no, bro, this is an educated guess, and let's let this thing morph over time. And guess what? We're going to be wrong a lot. I guess the one thing athletes can do well for me, like, if they give me permission to mess up. It's like, okay, all of a sudden now we're cracking knuckles. You do the same thing, right? So yeah, a lot of it's going to be how long the adaptations take to set in. It's going to be genetic. How long have you been training? Everything's an estimate, and there's many ways to progress. And but nothing beats a coach at the end or a good training partner. You have those two people in your life. You're going to be really good.
I remember. I'll be real quick at the story. Training with Barb, 2011, the one season she ever did, my wife. And, because she's not a super geeked out in the trenches bodybuilder, she makes reasonable, logical decisions based upon just what makes sense to her. Common sense rather than what she's been taught to do. She's in the middle of prep. She's tired. She's digging. She does half her leg workout and goes, I'll catch the rest, tomorrow. And I look at her, I'm like, you can't do that. You got to finish the fucking workout, And then she was like, why? And I was like, I don't have a good answer for that. 10 years later, we're talking about how 2 days can be useful. But this is only, my seventh year of lifting. And it was just a great example of how having a fresh set of eyes and just being honest and just thinking unemotionally about something. Before she'd been brought up in the dogma of, I can't be weak. I can't, during prep, you got to grind through that shit. Like, you got to act like it's the off season, even though you're only eating half the calories. Or you can be smart. I mean, up to you. And then grind when you have it in you. So, like, yeah, that was one of those moments where I was like, okay, who's the experienced bodybuilder here? Or maybe I'm just dumb, because clearly that makes a lot of sense. But it took me just kind of having that moment where someone asks you a basic question and you're like, I don't know why I do what I do. So folks, don't use your emotions, because they will inform your motive for motivation, and it's why you do what you do. Let that be the guide of the direction you need to go in, but then you need to make decisions from a place of looking at things. And a coach can help you do that. A workout partner can help you do that. Even setting up certain structures to objectively assess your own things for those who are self-coach, looking at videos, looking at pictures, getting a step back, I think can help you do that. But if you're just going off of what does a marketing material and your Instagram selected feed tell you what to do, you're going to be doing a lot of program hopping and not reaching your potential. So ask yourself the hard questions. Take some time, marinate in your emotions, and make decisions based upon an informed choice. And of course, as always, we got these awesome guys here at 3DMJ who are more than happy to help you do that a little bit better and work collaboratively with you. So I just want to give a big thanks to my fellows here, head coaches. We got a lot of heads on this Hydra. We got head coach Alberto Nunez. We got head coach Jeff Alberts joining me, just a lowly part-time coach who looks at research far too much, trying to help you understand these concepts. And also, these guys help me push myself to my furthest potential. I wouldn't be where I am without that objective perspective. So thank you very much for letting us help you better understand the concept of progression. And we'll catch you next time on the 3D Muscle Journey podcast.